Hello, welcome. In the quiet but weighty moments when our words and actions toward others carry eternal consequences, Jesus issues one of the most sobering warnings in Scripture. In Matthew 18:6, he turns his attention to the little ones, the vulnerable who believe with simple, trusting faith. This includes young children, new believers, and anyone whose heart remains open and tender toward God. With fierce tenderness, Jesus cautions against causing them to stumble. The Greek word skandalizo paints a vivid picture, deliberately placing a stumbling block that leads another into sin or away from faith entirely. To underscore the gravity, Jesus invokes a terrifying image, a massive millstone, the kind heavy enough to require a donkey to turn it, hung around the offender's neck before being cast into the depths of the sea. He declares that such a fate would be preferable to the judgment awaiting anyone who destroys the faith of the innocent. This passage stirs a holy awareness of the sacred responsibility we carry in how we treat the trusting and vulnerable. Far from harsh, these words draw us gently yet powerfully into Christ's heart, inviting us to rest in his clear call, to protect, nurture, and cherish simple faith with utmost care and love. The moment began with a question about greatness. The disciples had been arguing among themselves on the road, the particular argument that kept surfacing in their company, the one about positioning and precedence, and who among them would occupy the highest place in the kingdom they believed was coming. They arrived at Capernaum still carrying the argument, and Jesus, who knew what they had been discussing without being told, asked them about it directly. When they fell silent, the silence of people who know that what they were doing sounds worse when named aloud, he sat down and called a child to come and stand in the middle of the group. Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The child stood there while Jesus spoke about humility and trust, and the specific quality of receptiveness that children carried naturally and that adults had to relearn at some cost. The disciples looked at the child. The child probably looked back at them with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet learned to perform indifference. And then Jesus shifted. The tenderness of the teaching about childlike faith was still present. It never left. But something entered his voice that signaled a different register. Not anger exactly. Something more serious than anger, more measured and more final. The warning that was coming was not for those with simple faith. It was for those with influence over them. The Greek word translated as cause to stumble or offend was skandalizo, the same root from which the English word scandal descends, but carrying a more specific and more serious meaning than modern usage suggests. A scandalon was a trap, specifically the trigger mechanism of an animal trap, the part that, when touched, caused the trap to spring shut. To skandalizo someone was to place exactly this kind of device in their path, not to harm them directly, but to create the conditions under which they would harm themselves, to position something in their way that would cause them to fall when they stepped on it. In the context of faith, skandalizo described the act of causing another person to stumble in their relationship with God, to trip, to fall away, to have their trust damaged or destroyed by the action of someone who should have been helping them walk rather than placing obstacles in their path. This could be active, deliberate corruption, explicit leading astray, or it could be passive, the harsh word, the inconsistent example, the behavior of a believer that made the God they claimed to follow look unworthy of the trust that a younger or more vulnerable believer was in the process of developing. Jesus was describing a category of harm that was not limited to dramatic acts of corruption. He was describing the full range of ways in which those with established faith could, through carelessness or cruelty or inconsistency, damage the faith of those with fragile or new or simple trust, of the little ones who believe in me. It would be better for that person to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. The specific language Jesus used was precise and deliberately shocking. The millstone he described was not the small, handheld grinding stone that an individual woman might use in her kitchen. The Greek, moulos onikos, literally the millstone of a donkey, specified the enormous upper stone of a commercial mill, the kind of stone so heavy that it required a donkey to turn it, the kind of stone that could not be carried by a person and could not be moved without significant effort. This was not an exaggeration chosen for rhetorical effect and immediately understood as not literal. It was an image chosen because its meaning was completely clear. A person with a stone of this size around their neck would go to the bottom of the sea and stay there. There would be no surfacing. There would be no rescue. The death would be immediate, certain, and complete. And Jesus said this death, this specific, final, irreversible physical death, would be better than the alternative faced by the person who caused one of his little ones to stumble. The hyperbole, if it is hyperbole, was chosen to communicate something that ordinary language was insufficient to convey. The gravity of the spiritual judgment awaiting the person who destroyed another person's faith was so serious, so weightier than anything that could be done to the body, that even the most severe physical consequence imaginable was preferable to it. Jesus was not recommending drowning. He was establishing a comparison, and the comparison required something final enough, certain enough, complete enough to serve as a measure for what he was warning against. The disciples heard this, and the hearing stayed with them. The millstone image did not fade. It was the kind of image that attached itself to memory precisely because it refused to be comfortable. The kind of image that a person sees in their mind when they are about to say something careless to a new believer, about to act in a way that contradicts what they have proclaimed, about to prioritize their own convenience over the spiritual safety of someone whose faith is still fragile and forming. Who the little ones were. The child Jesus had called to stand in the midst was the visible, specific, concrete image of a larger and more comprehensive category. When he said little ones who believe in me, he was describing everyone who shared the essential quality that the child represented. The simple, trusting, humble, unguarded faith of someone who has not yet developed the protective defenses that sustained experience tends to build around a person's belief. This included, obviously, children. The actual children in every household and community who were watching the adults around them for evidence of whether the faith being professed was real, whose trust in God was inseparable from their trust in the people who represented God to them. It included new believers, people who had recently come to faith with the particular vulnerability of someone who has opened themselves to something they are not yet entirely sure of, who are still deciding whether the community they have entered is trustworthy, still looking at the behavior of established believers for evidence that the God they are beginning to trust is accurately represented by the people who claim to follow him. It included anyone whose faith was simple rather than sophisticated, the person who believed with the direct, uncomplicated trust of someone who had not yet learned to theorize about faith or defend it or analyze it, who simply held it in the open hands of someone who had not yet been given reason to close those hands. All of these were the little ones. All of them were under the specific protection of a warning so severe that the disciples who heard it remembered it for the rest of their lives and recorded it in the gospel they eventually produced. What Jesus was establishing in this warning was a theology of influence, a recognition that human beings do not exist in spiritual isolation, that the choices of those with more experience, more authority, or more visibility in a community of faith have consequences that extend into the faith of those with less. This is not a comfortable teaching. It is considerably easier to think of one's spiritual life as a private matter between oneself and God, in which the choices made are one's own business and the consequences belong to oneself alone. Jesus refused this framing entirely. He looked at his disciples, men whose influence over the communities of faith that would form around their testimony would be enormous, and told them that how they used that influence would be measured with a seriousness that the millstone image was designed to make impossible to minimize. The word spoken carelessly to a struggling believer. The inconsistency between profession and practice that a watching new convert observed and catalogued. The pride or cruelty or dismissiveness that made the God being proclaimed seem unlike the God worth trusting. The theological sophistication deployed as a weapon against simple faith rather than as a resource for nurturing it. All of these were the scandalon in the path, the trigger in the trap that Jesus had just described with the weight of the most severe warning he ever issued. The families who carried this teaching home and repeated it around their tables were not being given a rule to follow. They were being given a weight to feel, the specific, sobering weight of understanding that the faith of the little ones around them was, in some genuine and measurable degree, their responsibility. Older siblings with younger ones, parents with children, established believers with new ones, teachers with those who were learning. Everyone whose example, whose words, whose daily visible practice of faith was being observed and absorbed by someone whose trust was still forming. The child still stood in the midst. The millstone image had not faded, and the warning remained exactly as serious as Jesus had spoken it. To understand the full force of what Jesus was doing when he placed a child in the center of his disciples' argument about greatness, you need to understand what children represented in the social imagination of the first-century world, which was something quite different from what they represent in ours. In both the Jewish and the broader Greco-Roman culture of Jesus' day, children occupied the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy. They were, legally and socially, closer to property than to persons, dependent entirely on the decision of the father regarding whether they would be acknowledged, raised, or provided for. Roman law gave the paterfamilias the power of life and death over his children. Greek philosophical tradition had not historically celebrated childhood as a state of innocence or virtue, but as an incomplete condition requiring correction and formation before genuine worth could be established. In Jewish life, children were more warmly regarded within the family structure, and the Torah's commands regarding honoring parents and caring for family provided a framework of protection. But children still held no public status, no voice in community decisions, no recognized standing in the discussions of the learned. They were the least of the social hierarchy, present, dependent, and largely invisible to the theological discourse of the day. This is the cultural backdrop against which Jesus' gesture becomes radical. He called a child, the least, the lowest, the one with no social standing and no recognized claim to the attention of the room, and placed this child in the center of a discussion among the men who were arguing about who was greatest. The reversal was not subtle. He was turning the social hierarchy completely upside down, declaring the one the culture considered least significant to be the model for everything the kingdom of heaven required. The Greek word translated as cause to stumble, skandalizo, was not a mild term, and its full weight requires careful attention to understand what Jesus was actually warning against. The root skandalon referred to the trigger mechanism of an animal trap, the specific component that, when disturbed, caused the trap to spring and capture whatever had stepped on it. To skandalizo someone was to function as this mechanism in their path, not to attack them directly, but to arrange the conditions under which they would fall by their own step, to place in their way the specific thing that would cause them to trip, to be captured, to be caught in sin, or to fall away from the faith they had been walking in. This image was precise in a way that the English word stumble does not fully communicate. A stumbling block is passive. It simply exists in the path. The skandalon was active. It was designed to catch, to trap, to prevent return. To cause someone to skandalizo was to function as a spiritual predator, setting the conditions under which a vulnerable believer would fall and be captured by whatever it was the trap was designed to produce. Jesus was not describing accidental harm caused by carelessness, though carelessness could certainly produce the same result. He was describing the full range of actions, intentional and unintentional, through which those with influence over the faith of others could function as traps in the path of those who were simply trying to walk toward God. The specific image Jesus chose to communicate the gravity of this warning was selected with the kind of precision that the best teachers consistently employ, the image that is concrete enough to be impossible to abstract into comfort. The moulos onikos, the donkey millstone, was not the small portable hand mill that an individual woman might use to grind her family's daily grain. It was the enormous upper stone of a commercial grinding operation, a stone so heavy that it required the sustained labor of a donkey to turn it, a stone that could not be lifted by a person without assistance and could not be moved quickly or casually. This was a stone whose weight was immediately visible and immediately communicable. Everyone in Jesus' audience who had seen a working mill knew exactly what this stone looked like and how it moved and how much it weighed. The image Jesus attached to this stone was drowning in the depths of the sea, and the combination was designed to produce a single, unmistakable conclusion. There would be no return. A person with a stone of this size and weight around their neck would go to the bottom of the sea immediately, completely, and permanently. The death would not be the kind from which rescue was conceivable. It would be final in the most absolute physical sense available to describe. And Jesus said this death was preferable, not as a recommendation of the method, as a comparison designed to establish a scale. If the most absolute, irreversible physical death imaginable was preferable to the alternative, then the alternative, the spiritual judgment awaiting the person who caused one of his little ones to stumble, was being placed on a scale that weighted it more heavily than anything that could be done to the body. This was the theological claim embedded in the image. Spiritual harm is categorically more serious than physical harm. The body can be killed and the soul remain. The faith of a little one can be destroyed, and the damage is of a different order entirely. Damage that touches the eternal rather than merely the temporal, damage whose consequences extend beyond what any physical consequence can reach. The early Christian communities that received and transmitted this teaching understood little ones who believe in me to extend well beyond the literal children Jesus had used as his visual aid. The phrase was consistently applied to new believers, people who had recently come to faith with the specific vulnerability of someone who had opened themselves to trust in something they were not yet entirely certain of, who were watching the established community for evidence that the God being proclaimed was accurately represented by the people who claimed to follow him. A new believer was a little one in the most relevant sense, dependent on the example and teaching and care of those with more established faith, at risk from inconsistency and harshness and theological carelessness in ways that would not affect a more seasoned disciple in the same degree. The early church's leadership literature consistently applied this warning to those in positions of teaching and authority, the ones whose influence over the faith of others was most significant, and therefore whose responsibility for that influence was most serious. The Didache, the early Christian teaching document, reflected this concern directly in its instructions about teachers and their relationship to the community they served. The pastoral letters of Paul to Timothy and Titus were saturated with the same concern, that those who led and taught the community of faith bore a specific responsibility for the spiritual condition of those in their care that went beyond what ordinary members carried. What Jesus was establishing in Matthew 18:6 was not merely a personal warning about individual behavior. He was establishing a theology of communal responsibility for the faith of the vulnerable. The disciples who heard this warning were not being told to be careful only about what they did to children in the literal sense. They were being told that the faith communities forming around their testimony, the new believers, the vulnerable, the simple trusting, the recently converted, the ones whose faith was still fragile and forming, were under their specific protection, and that the use of their influence would be measured with the seriousness that the millstone image was designed to make impossible to forget. The early church took this seriously enough that the protection of new believers and vulnerable members became a structural concern in the formation of community life, not merely a personal virtue to be encouraged, but a communal responsibility to be organized around. The little ones were not peripheral to the community's concern. They were, in the theology of Matthew 18, the specific focus of the most severe warning Jesus ever issued to his disciples. Jesus placed a child in the center of the room and then issued the most severe warning in the Gospels about what it means to harm one. The psychological insight embedded in this sequence is profound. The people most susceptible to the damage Jesus was describing are precisely the people least equipped to defend themselves against it. The little one, the child, The new believer, the person whose faith is simple and unguarded and still forming, is vulnerable in direct proportion to the openness that makes them capable of genuine faith at all. The trust that makes a little one precious is the same trust that makes them fragile. The open hand that receives cannot simultaneously defend itself. Modern developmental psychology has confirmed what Jesus was warning about with a precision that his first-century language did not require, but that contemporary understanding can supply. The research on attachment and trust formation consistently demonstrates that the people who shape the early stages of a person's trust, whether in human relationships or in God, leave marks that are not easily removed and not quickly faded. The quality of care received in the formative period of trust development shapes the neural architecture through which all subsequent trust is processed. A person whose early trust was consistently honored develops a different baseline expectation of relationship than a person whose early trust was exploited or damaged. In the context of faith, this means that what happens to a person in the early, fragile, forming stage of their belief carries consequences that extend far beyond the incident itself. The harsh word spoken to a new believer in their first months of faith does not land the same way it would land with a person whose faith has been tested and confirmed across decades. The inconsistency witnessed in a trusted teacher by someone who has just begun to trust does not produce the same response in that new believer as it might produce in someone whose relationship with God is rooted and established. The skandalon placed in the path of the little one catches them at precisely the moment when they have the least capacity to step over it. The Greek image of skandalizo, the trap trigger, the mechanism that causes the fall, captures something psychologically accurate about how damage to fragile faith operates. It does not typically announce itself. The trap does not look like a trap when it is first encountered. It looks like a reasonable question raised by someone who should know, is this God really worth trusting? It looks like the behavior of an established believer that makes the God they proclaim seem inconsistent or distant or unworthy of the simple confidence the new believer was in the process of developing. It looks like the theological criticism that dismantles simple faith without providing anything to replace it, leaving the little one with less than they had before the encounter began. The damage the skandalon produces is rarely immediate and visible. It is more often the slow erosion of confidence, the accumulating doubt that does not produce dramatic crisis, but gradually makes the posture of trust more difficult to maintain. The new believer who has been stumbled does not usually announce their stumbling. They simply become less present, less engaged, less willing to bring the vulnerable questions that genuine faith requires the freedom to ask. They learn from the stumbling that the community or the person or the God they were beginning to trust is less safe than they had believed, and that learning reshapes every subsequent interaction with faith in ways that may not be visible for years. Research on religious trauma consistently identifies this pattern. The most lasting damage is not usually produced by dramatic betrayal or explicit cruelty, though these cause severe harm. It is produced by the sustained, low-grade experience of a faith community that was inconsistent in its care, careless in its speech, and insufficiently attentive to the specific vulnerability of those who were just beginning to trust. The little ones who are stumbled in this way often spend years in the particular spiritual confusion of people who wanted to believe and were not given the conditions in which believing was safe enough to sustain. The psychological portrait the parable implies on the positive side is equally important. Communities and individuals who take seriously their responsibility to protect the faith of the vulnerable, who handle the little ones with the specific care that fragile trust requires, produce the conditions in which genuine faith can develop into something durable. The new believer who is handled gently, whose simple trust is honored rather than exploited or dismissed, whose questions are received without condescension, and whose early faith is protected from the scandala that would have tripped it before it had time to deepen. This person develops a relationship with God that has been given the conditions it needed to become genuinely rooted. The early gentleness becomes the foundation of a later resilience that could not have developed without the safety of the forming period. This is what Jesus was protecting when he placed the child in the center of the room and issued the warning that followed. Not naivety, not permanent fragility. The specific, time-limited, irreplaceable window of early trust in which what happens to a little one determines what kind of believer they will have the chance to become. The weight of influence on the vulnerable is not a burden to be resented. It is a responsibility to be taken with the seriousness that the millstone image requires, the seriousness of someone who understands that what they do to the little one in their path will be measured, that the trust placed in them is not theirs to exploit, and that the God who called a child to stand in the midst of the disciples is watching what his people do with the little ones he has placed in theirs. The warning Jesus issued was not abstract. It described a specific category of harm with specific consequences, and the communities that heard the warning and passed it down through their gatherings understood it to be describing something they had already seen. A new believer who had come to faith with the particular openness of someone who had set down their defenses and chosen to trust. This person was the little one most immediately at risk. They had extended the kind of trust that cannot be partially given. They had believed with the whole and unguarded quality of someone who had not yet learned to protect themselves from the disappointment that broken trust produces. And when the established believer whose example they were watching behaved in a way that contradicted the God being proclaimed, harshly, hypocritically, dismissively, carelessly, the damage landed in the place where the trust was most exposed. The fall away was rarely dramatic. It did not usually announce itself as a theological crisis or a formal departure from faith. It happened in the quiet withdrawal of someone who had decided, on the basis of what they had witnessed, that the God being proclaimed was not accurately represented by the community claiming to follow him, or worse, that he was. The little one who was stumbled in this way often left silently, carrying a wound that no one in the community noticed was there, because the stumbling had been equally unnoticed by those who caused it. Children watching inconsistent adults absorbed the inconsistency before they had the theological framework to name what they were seeing. The gap between what the parents or teachers proclaimed and what they practiced was registered not as a theological problem, but as an emotional one. the specific confusion of a child who has been told that something is true and has watched the people telling them demonstrate repeatedly that it may not be. The millstone image in this context was not hyperbole chosen for dramatic effect and immediately understood as not serious. It was the specific, carefully chosen image of a consequence so final, so certain, so impossible to reverse, that Jesus used it as the lower bound of comparison for something even more serious. The person who placed the scandalon in the path of a little one, who caused the fall, who damaged the fragile trust, who placed the trap that caught the new believer, or the vulnerable child, or the simple trusting soul in the moment of their greatest openness. This person faced a judgment that the physical death of millstone drowning was preferable to. Not marginally preferable, clearly and certainly preferable in a way that the image was designed to make impossible to dismiss. The early communities that heard this warning recorded it and transmitted it and placed it in the Gospels precisely because they had seen the damage it described and understood the gravity that the image measured. Leaders who exploited the vulnerability of new believers. Teachers whose theological cruelty dismantled simple faith without offering anything in its place. Community members whose inconsistency made the God they proclaimed seem unworthy of the trust the little ones were in the process of developing. The harm these produced was not minor. It was the damage Jesus was specifically, dramatically, and with unprecedented severity warning against. The damage of a scandalon placed in the path of a little one, at the moment when the little one's trust was most open and therefore most fragile and most exposed to the consequences of being tripped. The millstone did not float, and Jesus said the judgment for causing this harm was heavier still. The millstone image was not given to produce despair. It was given to produce the specific, serious, sustained transformation of people who had heard the weight of the warning and had decided that their relationship to the little ones around them was going to change as a result. For the disciples who first received this teaching, the transformation began in the same moment the warning was given, in the sight of the child standing in the center of the room, in the radical reorientation of their understanding of greatness, in the discovery that the one they had been arguing about being closest to was not the most powerful among them, but the one who received the least powerful with the most genuine welcome. The argument about greatness did not simply end. It was replaced by a different question. Not who among us is greatest, but how are we treating the little ones in our midst? This is the transformation the warning produces when it is genuinely received. Not a new rule to follow, but a new question to live by. The disciple who has felt the weight of Matthew 18:6 moves through their community differently. They become aware, perhaps for the first time with genuine seriousness, of the influence their words and actions carry over the people whose faith is still fragile and forming. They begin to notice the little ones who had previously been invisible, the new believer sitting on the edge of the gathering, the child watching everything the adults around them do, the vulnerable person whose trust is present but has not yet been tested and proven across the duration of difficulty. The awareness changes the behavior. The speech becomes more careful, not in the performative sense of someone managing their words for an audience, but in the genuine sense of someone who has understood that what they say to a little one lands differently than they had previously appreciated. The inconsistency between profession and practice becomes uncomfortable in a new way, because the little ones are now visible as the people who are watching that inconsistency most closely and absorbing it most deeply. The early communities that took this warning seriously became characterized by a specific quality that distinguished them from the surrounding culture: the deliberate, structured care of the vulnerable among them. This was not incidental. The early church's unusual attention to children, new believers, widows, and the socially marginal was not simply a general humanitarian impulse. It was the direct expression of a theology shaped by Jesus' teaching in Matthew 18, the understanding that the little ones in the community were under the specific protection of the most severe warning he had ever issued, and that the community's responsibility toward them was therefore of the most serious order. Communities that genuinely embodied this protection found that the little ones in their midst grew. The faith that had been fragile and forming when it arrived in the community became, under the conditions of genuine care, something more durable and more deeply rooted. The new believer who was handled gently in the early, vulnerable months of their faith developed a relationship with God that had been given the conditions it needed to become genuinely strong. The transformation at the personal level was equally real. The person who had spoken carelessly to a struggling believer and had seen the damage it produced, who had watched the little one withdraw, had traced the withdrawal to their own carelessness, and had brought that recognition honestly before God, did not simply resolve to speak more carefully. They were changed in a more fundamental way. They became people whose awareness of influence had been permanently elevated, whose treatment of the little ones around them was now shaped by the understanding that the trust placed in them was not theirs to waste. They became, in the language of the parable's positive vision, protectors. And under their protection, simple trust had room to become something that would last. The first practical step Matthew 18:6 requires is simple and searching. Become genuinely aware of the little ones currently within your sphere of influence, not in the abstract, specifically. The child in your home who is forming their understanding of who God is, largely by watching who you are when the pressure is real and the audience is small. The new believer in your community who arrived with the particular openness of someone who has not yet learned to protect themselves from disappointment, who is watching your consistency between Sunday profession and Monday behavior as evidence for whether the faith they are considering is worth its cost. The vulnerable person whose trust has been damaged before and who is extending it again carefully, tentatively, looking for evidence that this time it will be safe. Name them. Make them specific and visible to yourself before the next conversation, the next interaction, the next moment when your words or actions will either build their faith or place something in its path. The skandalon is most often placed by people who were not paying attention to who was watching. Guard the words. Speech is where the stumbling block most commonly appears in ordinary life, the casual theological judgment that lands on a new believer's fragile confidence like a verdict, the correction delivered with an accuracy that is not matched by the gentleness the situation required, the dismissive response to a sincere question that communicates that the questioner's simple faith is not worth serious engagement. Before speaking to a little one about their faith, Pause long enough to ask whether what you are about to say will build or whether it will place something in their path. Truth must be spoken, but truth spoken without gentleness to someone whose trust is still forming does the work of the skandalon regardless of its accuracy. Choose words that point toward Christ rather than toward your own theological confidence. Choose the tone that makes the little one feel received rather than evaluated. Choose the response that opens the door wider rather than the one that introduces the first reason to wonder whether the door should have been opened at all. Inconsistency between profession and practice is one of the most damaging stumbling blocks placed in the path of little ones, precisely because it is invisible to the person whose inconsistency it is, and entirely visible to the person watching. Children and new believers are not primarily formed by what they are taught. They are formed by what they observe. The gap between the God being described and the person doing the describing is registered before it is articulated, absorbed before it is named, and its effects on fragile faith are often not visible until the damage has already been done. Live as consistently as you are able in a way that makes your proclamation credible to the people who are watching it most closely. Not the performance of consistency for an audience, genuine alignment between what you say about God and how you treat the people around you when saying anything about God was not on your agenda. Build the protective environment together. The responsibility Matthew 18:6 establishes is not only individual, it is communal. The shared responsibility of a community that has heard the warning and has decided together that the little ones in its midst are under their collective protection. Talk about this responsibility with the people around you. Teach it to the people who teach children. Establish it as a communal value that the vulnerable members of your community can genuinely rely on. Not the announced intention to care for the little ones, but the lived, consistent, daily practice of a community that has taken the weight of the millstone seriously enough to remove the stumbling blocks from every path it has the ability to clear. The child had been standing in the center of the room, not as a prop, not as a rhetorical device to be set aside when the illustration was finished. As a person, small, present, entirely without defense, representing in their simple, unguarded trust everything that the kingdom of heaven most valued, and everything that required the most careful protection from those entrusted with influence over it. Jesus had placed this child there deliberately, in the middle of an argument about greatness, and everything he said after that placement was shaped by the child's continued presence. The teaching about humility, the warning about stumbling blocks, the millstone image so severe that it had no precedent in anything he had previously said to these men. All of it spoken with the child still there, still visible, still representing the little ones of every generation who would come after, still embodying the simple trust that the most powerful warning in the Gospels was designed to protect. The disciples carried this home, not as abstract theology to be filed and forgotten, but as the specific, weighted, impossible to minimize responsibility of people who had been told by Jesus himself that what they did to the little ones in their path would be measured with a seriousness that the depths of the sea could not contain. The little ones are still in the center of the room. The warning has not diminished with the passing of centuries. And the God who placed the child there is still watching what his people do with the vulnerable, the simple trusting, the newly believing, the fragile in faith souls who have been placed in our path. Guard them with the gentleness the warning requires. They are the ones Jesus called to stand in the midst, and they are still standing there. Rest well.